Welcome back to Worlds Beyond with Cam and Ron. Say hi, Cam.
Hey, how's it going?
I'm doing good. I hope you're doing good. I
I'm
know you're
doing
doing
great. I
good.
finished all my work this morning, so very early
It's
this morning.
weird.
So I've had a nice free afternoon.
All right, this episode we are going to be talking about the new James Wan horror film released
Woo!
on September 10th, Malignant. Very good, very cool name.
Yeah, it's following the trend of just synonyms for bad that he likes to use. Insidious, and then he didn't do Sinister, but all of
Insidious.
those movies. Yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue as well as Insidious does, but no, it makes sense. Makes sense for the film. So, like we were talking about, maybe a week or so before the movie came out, the trailers didn't really give all that much away to the point where we were
Yeah,
kind of
yeah.
wondering like what it was even about. And then I went into it almost thinking it was going to be more of a serious movie, and that's kind of how I watched it. I thought it was solid all the way through, but it seemed like it wasn't as serious as I was expecting. And then towards the end, obviously, it just went completely bonkers crazy. But I liked it because it seemed like James Wan was really almost like he went back in time to like 1999 or 2000 and told him back then to make a movie with a bigger budget than he might have had, and this is kind of the result of that. And I think you see, so it's like a pure kind of James Wan distilled experience where it's really fun, a little bit silly, a little bit scary, a little bit gross, and obviously you have plenty of great, really cool scares with great cinematography. And I think he was really going for that kind of late 90s, early 2000s horror movie feel, especially with that kind of like goofy new metal alt rock intro. As I was watching the movie, I noticed that it was really just hitting on every single thing that we have seen in his previous films, all just kind of mashed into one. And you can really start to see that he is putting things like I think a lot of horror film directors do, putting elements that are things that scare him. So you have like in the first Saw movie, you have Jigsaw's workshop, which is in this abandoned factory, and it has all these creepy, tools and stuff for making his traps. And you see that pop up in Insidious. You have the Demon's workshop where he's sharpening his claws, and then the Demon's workshop is filled with puppets, and obviously, Billy the puppet is Jigsaw's puppet. And then, so while I was watching the movie, I was wondering, all right, so we've hit on creepy workshops and demons and abandoned warehouses and all that sort of stuff. I'm surprised I haven't mentioned puppets. And then, without getting too much into spoilers, they do reference puppets towards the end, which I thought was really funny. But yeah, those are just my initial thoughts. We can get into spoilers once we get into more detailed thoughts. What are your initial reactions and thoughts to the movie?
Um, yeah, overall, obviously, we should probably preface this with, we have a very, I don't know, I guess it is differing approach to horror. I'm definitely much more, being the older guy, much more old school in my horror taste. I'm definitely much more of a like, I like creepy, suspenseful, very sort of mythological based horror. And I love the old Hammer horrors and all that stuff, and not a big gore like whack up or super disturbing horror is not very much not my thing. I know you're a little bit more sort of well rounded, or you like a little bit of everything. So that, and then I would say I'm a lot more. I'm familiar with horror directors, like I know John Carpenter, I know Wes Craven. Again, more of the older school, and I know you're much more well schooled and tuned into all of the more recent directors than I am, and so I listened with very much interest in your talking about the different James Wan tropes and everything else. That was really, I hadn't even thought about that. Very much that sort of like Korn, Slipknot, like new metal kind of vibe to the soundtrack and everything. So overall, my reaction was I was expecting something a lot more kind of like mind f psychological disturbing, and again this came out much more of a middle of the road. This is much more like my speed of horror, like crazy and wild but not too over the top, and a good sort of suspenseful story. um, so overall, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. It did get a little slow for me in the middle, and I would say it got a little bit like way kooky for me at the end. But I guess that's kind of what he was going for. So yeah, so my overall reaction um, was was really good. And then as we get into some more details, I'll talk about that. But I would just say that's my sort of first blush reaction was some ups and downs for me, but overall really good and pleasantly surprised that I expected to be like, oh, this is probably not going to be my kind of thing, but turned out it was like right good level of horror for me, and at times, and I wonder, I think you might have even said this, in an outside conversation. It was almost kind of like more like action, you know, action movie like
Oh yeah,
crime
yeah,
drama
totally.
thing. It totally
Yeah.
went into that where it didn't even feel like a horror movie at times. But and I think that's and our your dad, my brother Fred. I remember him saying like, didn't seem that scary to me, and he's obviously a much deeper horror person than I am, like similar to you. But yeah, those are my overall reactions.
I guess this is getting into deep thoughts now. I'm not going to talk about spoilers just yet, but uh, keep in mind that we are going to be going to spoilers. I think it's great that you mentioned the kind of action movie comparison, and that's something I even said about Conjuring 2, and then to a lesser extent Conjuring 1 and Insidious, is that it almost gets into kind of action movie territory, and you can kind of, especially after James Wan did Fast and Furious 872, whatever he did, and then obviously Aquaman, you can really start to see that he's incorporating more like kind of bombastic CG. Not and I don't and when I say CGI, I don't mean that in a negative way. I think a lot of people do, but kind of like CGI based crazy. And I think probably a lot of this in the film was probably practical, but I just think a lot of that kind of blockbuster action is seeing its way into James Wan's horror films, especially this one. Um, yeah, so the first like kind of well, it is a long movie. And it's yeah. You said that it was a little bit slow. I agree. It did drag a little bit in the middle, and I was surprised at how long it was. I was expecting it to be, I don't know, 90 minutes tops, but it was actually closer to 2 hours. I think it was an hour
Yeah,
and 50.
I think I said to you, I said I think this movie could have been like 15 minutes shorter, and
I
it would have
think
been
yeah,
like
it probably
yeah.
could too, but I did like that they really spent time building up everything, and then I guess this is the point where we'll get into spoilers once it reveals the kind of crazy twists of the movie, that there's this
Yeah.
kind of like conjoined twin tumor thing that is taking over the main character and causing her to kill people. I really wasn't expecting that, only because I thought the main character killing people was a little bit too obvious, at least starting out. But then once they explained it, obviously that whole segment where they showed the mom and sister watching the medical tapes was
Yeah, yeah,
really
yeah.
disturbing and
Yeah,
hilarious.
I thought I was super smart for like I guessed the twin thing fairly early
Oh,
on, but
really?
then
Wow.
I didn't know it was going in the direction that
Right,
it
right.
was.
Yeah, no.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, no, I really didn't. I was kind of thinking it was just kind of a traditional mystery, supernatural mystery horror in the same vein as Insidious. But then obviously once that twist came, and then the jail cell fight onward was just like completely bonkers and off the walls crazy. Maybe too much. So I don't really know how it's doing in the box office or like with general audiences, but it seems like its advertising is still going and everything else. So I think it's been pretty well received across the board. But I definitely wasn't expecting it to get as crazy as it did. Like, and yeah, no, you were mentioning my dad's reaction. Yeah, he said it was almost like a Matrix or John Wick kind of movie. And yeah, the killer at the end, Gabriel, does some just really insane stunts and kind of John Wick Matrix style action, but in a slasher vein. So it's super gory and lots of special effects. And then the very like end of that scene where he like flips the chair over and hits both of them was just
Yeah.
hilarious and really well done. So yeah, no, I think overall it wasn't meant to be taken as seriously as maybe they were advertising it, and I would like to see it again. One, with that in mind, and two, with my friends, because I think they would appreciate that angle, and they would get. I think I would get a lot more out of the kind of almost like stilted dialogue and purposeful cheese than I did the first time around. Now that I know exactly what it's going for.
But there seemed to be a dichotomy in terms of like the visuals and stuff. At times it seemed very sort of like 80s homage. At times it seemed a little bit almost had this like almost like Harry Potter, the wide shots of the lake and the old sanitarium had that sort of feel to them, and similar to what my brother Fred, your dad, said. I think that sort of genre bending part of it was one of the really cool things because it did have that, in those sort of vision sequences, it did have that sort of like Matrix or just sort of wacky sci-fi feel to it. And I don't know how the other entity there had come up with such amazing martial arts skills like out of nowhere, but it certainly was pretty cool.
Right. Yeah, it's not something you should really. Yeah, I mean they had supernatural powers too. It seemed like with the electricity and everything. So I don't think there was much of a logic there.
Yeah, no, it seemed, and there certainly were a few things that like the the creature was sort of overpowered and then underpowered to meet you know to meet the needs of the scene, like the chase scene with the detective there, the lead detective. Like I was like, okay, he's definitely dead. But then he made it through that whole ordeal alive, and I was like, wow, I thought this thing would just been able to wipe him out with the power that it's shown so far. I like the level of gore was pretty much okay for me. It wasn't too crazy. I will say I think like the part that got me, other than like it feeling a little padded through the middle, in the final crazy scene, again, everyone has their personal, suspension of disbelief. For me, just the number of people that got wiped out, from the prison scene through the end of the movie, and then the idea that she locked this thing back away inside her, and I mean, I just don't see how she's not going to get locked up, or even like get the death penalty for the carnage that ensued. You can't just be like, oh well, the thing's gone away and she's back to normal.
Technically, her doing that, I guess, so they have to deal with that somehow.
Yeah. So how do you rationalize or justify that?
Yeah, well, I have a feeling we're probably going to get a sequel. It seems like they were at least leaving it open. I don't necessarily think they set it up, set a sequel up, but they left it open for the possibility for a sequel. And I have to imagine if it does well, they'll probably do a Saw or Insidious move where they'll give the sequel to someone else and maybe have James Wan do an outline or a story consultant kind of thing. And I'm sure if that one's popular, we'll get Malignant 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 7. So I'll be interested in, and I have a feeling they'll be of lesser quality, but we'll get more carnage and action. So it'll be interesting to see where they go with that. My odds and ends, it's kind of funny. I feel like the house that the main character, I can't remember her name, the main character lived in, I've definitely seen it in like at least 2 other horror movies. If I'm not mistaken, I want to say it's the same house that was in Annabelle Creation, which was the second Annabelle movie. But I think I'm wrong, but it may have even been the same house from Insidious. It looked identical. It had that, and James Wan always uses that a similar house layout because there's always stairs across from, and I mean obviously houses have similar layouts, but it seems like he likes to do scares in kind of houses with open floor plans that have a stairway across from a kind of foyer living room. It's like this is, if you look at the house in Insidious and the house in The Conjuring, and in this house, I mean, they look identical. I just thought that was really funny. But other than
Yeah,
that,
no, actually, that reminded me of something that really struck me as cool from a cinematography or whatever standpoint was um, when they had that scene where I don't know whether the main character was being stalked through the house or which part of the movie it was, but like when they showed the house, like as if the roof had been cut off and you were looking down into the multiple floors and you could see, as they were kind of like cat and mousing, through the house. That view from the top, that was something I hadn't seen before. That I thought was pretty cool.
yeah, no, James Wan. I think that's probably why he chooses houses. I mean, I'm sure there's probably some aesthetic reason too, but also those open floor plan kind of houses allow for cool cinematography like that. So yeah, no, I greatly enjoyed it, and I'm probably gonna watch it again in the near future now that it's immediately on HBO Max. That's very nice. But I wanted to see it in the theater first just to support the release and everything else.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, that's a wrap on Malignant. Next up for us is our launch into the Halloween season and looking at some classic horror characters and classic horror movies in a particular lens of looking at the original film version of a character or a horror story, and then a sort of mid-period version of it, and then a more recent version of it. We're going to be doing this with several characters. Today we're starting off with the Dracula, the Prince of Darkness, and we're going to give you our reaction.
Right, yeah. I really wanted to kind of go through the classic horror characters, but really see them as they are portrayed throughout the different eras. And so I wanted to kind of limit myself to 3 movies. Otherwise, there's tons of Dracula movies and there's tons of Frankenstein movies, but I wanted to stick to first entries in the series that kind of adapt Bram Stoker's original text as opposed to sequels and spin-offs. So with that in mind, I chose obviously the 1931 Universal Pictures Dracula that kicked off their slate of monster films. And then similarly, I chose Hammer's 1958 entry, which was that their first film or...
No, Curse of Frankenstein was their sort of first of those color Hammer horrors. Dracula was second. But it's obviously the introduction of Christopher Lee's classic portrayal of the vamp.
Then I went with Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula with Gary Oldman as the Count. And so, yeah, I guess getting just right into it, I will kind of rank those 3 and give you my thoughts about each of them. So at the bottom, unfortunately, and I know you're going to have something to say to this, is the 58 Hammer horror. And I do want to say it's not because I disliked it. I just think I got more out of the other 2 than this one in particular. And I just kind of feel like the story and characters aren't quite as interesting as the other 2 entries. I find that the pacing of the story is kind of weird. It starts out very strong, and I just find that it gets a little bit too like clinical with the discussions between all the characters, and I find that there's kind of a lack of scares. It almost feels like it's mostly just exposition, whereas and I won't get into too much of Frankenstein and other Hammer films, but I found that the scares were a lot more effective in Frankenstein and The Mummy, which I recently finished. And I also just found the characters not as compelling as the other two. As much as I love the portrayals of Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, I just found that I wasn't as invested in their characters as I was with some of the other entries. One thing that comes to mind, I think towards the beginning of the film, is I think Van Helsing has a chance to kill Dracula. Like, he is looking at Dracula with a stake in his hand, but then decides to move over to his bride there that's next to him and kill her first, which of course allows Dracula to get up and escape. That to me just kind of exemplifies the kind of weird, kind of wonkiness of the plot. It seems like there's a lot of contrivances to kind of get it to where it needs to go. But that being said, obviously, like every Hammer horror film, the set design and costumes and special effects and everything else are top notch. I love the Gothic architecture of Dracula's castle, and really the exterior scenes especially I find really cool in that film. But I'm interested in seeing what your kind of rebuttal to that is.
Yeah, so for me, obviously Hammer's Dracula is my number one. I'm just a huge fan of Hammer horror and just the Victorian Gothic settings. As you said, like the set design, the score by James Bernard for that movie, I think is one of the most just classic scary movie film scores ever. They did take a lot of license with the story, obviously, changing the order of things around. I mean, all of the movies do to some degree. Cushing and Lee are tremendous. The opening scene with Jonathan Harker at the castle, and then the woman vampire coming upon him, and then just how he basically descends to his doom. I will agree with you that I think a lot of the scares and the intensity are at the beginning and the end of the movie, and the middle does get into a lot of vampire lore and a lot of getting from here to there stuff. So yeah, so the movie's definitely weighted, sort of like a horseshoe. It's like it's a very strong opening and very strong ending. I think the ending, however, is really tremendous. Like that fight scene at the end with Cushing and Lee, and him melting with the sun on the floor. I mean, that's tremendous. Obviously the special effects aren't great, but they were really, really effective for their time. And again, just the cinematography, the drippingly rich color, the film, the performances. Yeah. I think by today's standards, almost any of those movies from those era are going to seem a little more dry from a character standpoint than modern movies.
Yeah, and British too, I think, has something
British,
to do with it.
To some degree, not to disparage the British, but yeah, and like there's just a whole bunch of creepy scenes. Like obviously the castle stuff is tremendous in the opening scene. One of my favorite parts, and one of the things that I think is so creepy about this movie, is after Lucy is killed and she rises and starts stalking around the town and lures the servant's daughter out into the moonlight and leads her back to the grave, and just her face is so pale. Like I just thought that was like really super creepy. So yeah, so for me, Hammers is number one.
Yeah, and then number two for me would definitely be 1931, the original Universal Dracula. And I think it being one of the earliest Universal monster movie, and just one of the earliest monster movies in general, it is very rough, but I think the fact I have a lot of respect for it because it's the earliest one. And not everything is like, I actually think that the plot and characters aren't as like super intriguing as maybe in a modern film, but I think Dracula really carries this one. Bela Lugosi's performance as Dracula is just like really incredible, and it's kind of silly and not super serious, but I think it just works for the tone of the film. And obviously he kind of set that standard of how all the stereotypical Dracula vampire parodies sound. So I like it for that kind of iconic aspect. But I really love the set design in this one too, especially Dracula's castle. That has that really long, tall staircase that who is it? Is it Renfield? I think falls down at one point, and he just like tumbles down the entire thing. It's kind of comical. So yeah, there's a lot of kind of stuff that might seem comical now, but overall, I think the performances, especially Dracula and Renfield too, I really like. I don't know what that actor's name is, but he's in all those Universal ones, and he always plays the crazy, kooky guy that goes insane from seeing the monster. And his voice and performance is just really kind of funny and flamboyant, and so I like that. And then at the end, I really like how, obviously, they haven't got the technology for any sort of big fight scenes or anything like that, so it's more just kind of a battle of words and wits between Dracula and Van Helsing, with a little bit of action at the end when they finally manage to track him down and drive a stake into his heart. But I think part of the reason this works better for me than Hammer is because it's a lot shorter. I think Hammer's a full 90-minute runtime, whereas this, I think, is just over an hour. And as a result, it feels a lot snappier. Especially compared to Nosferatu, which came out in 22, which has a very similar. I mean, it's an unlicensed kind of adaptation of Dracula, so it's the same plot, but that feels really, really, really slow, especially because it's silent and it's an hour and a half. So I think this being just an hour really helps.
Yeah, I'm just looking at it. It's like it says 75 minutes.
Oh wow, yeah, okay.
So it's actually longer than I thought, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what are your thoughts on?
So yeah, obviously Hammers is number one for me. I don't love either the 92 one all that much or the original. So I kind of want to give Bram Stoker's the nod for the number 2 spot just because it's obviously clearly a vastly superior film. But then I want to give the 1931 version for just, Bela Lugosi, and it's the original. So I guess I'm going to call this my number 2, just to make a decision. Overall, like you said, I think there's some classic things there, like what they did with the sets. I mean, I don't know if they used real castles or not, but it certainly just looks absolutely tremendous. The characterizations, obviously, the two romantic leads there are just completely forgettable in my opinion. Lugosi was obviously tremendous, the guy who played Van Helsing. His character was very good and very similar to how he sort of sounds and was portrayed in the book. And Renfield, that was the performance that really struck me as like, wow, this guy is really, obviously was super over the top and everything else, but I thought it was super crazy, scary, maniacal for that type of a film where everything else was kind of campy, almost unintentionally campy. But the film itself, I felt like it was just a bunch of theatrical segments just sort of stitched together. It just didn't feel, and I remember there's one scene at somebody's home and Dracula has now come and he's starting to appear as a bat and stuff like that. And the conversation is just completely non sequitur. And it just there was just so many things that were wow, this is really, just felt really shoddy to me. And that might be an unfair statement. However, not getting ahead of ourselves into our other topics, but by contrast, Frankenstein, which I think was made just a year later, just seems much more, by sort of modern standards, a much more coherent and well put together film compared to this one. So that's just what struck me about the 1931 Dracula when I watched it.
Yeah, that's funny. That's actually kind of how I feel about the Hammer Dracula, and even comparing it to the Hammer Frankenstein, that felt more like a cohesive plot with interesting characters, as opposed to the Hammer Dracula, which was, I felt, a little bit disjointed. But no, that's interesting that we kind of feel kind of the exact opposite about that. But yeah, no, I know you saw Bram Stoker's Dracula at 1992 in the theater, and then haven't seen it since then. I just recently watched it for the first time, and I personally think that you would probably get more out of it now.
Yeah, I definitely need to watch it again. I didn't have time to watch it before we connected, but I figured since I had seen it,
that's fine. Yeah, and seeing it in the theater obviously is a cool experience. But I almost wonder if you would appreciate it more now that we've both kind of expanded our media kind of interests, not interests, but we're I think a little bit more open maybe than you were in 1992, because it is kind of a weird, artsy, fartsy kind of film. It's not the most straightforward, but I will say it's not totally out there. It's not completely incomprehensible. It's still a traditional, it has a fairly traditional story, and this one really goes into Dracula's backstory. There's this whole kind of 10-20 minute intro sequence that describes how he became a vampire, and that's really cool. But for me, this is my number one, only just because it feels the most coherent, and it also brings in all of the best elements from the previous two while adding its own. And I think a lot of that is due to it following the story, I think, closely. You've read the original story. I haven't. But from what I understand, at least from watching that really good 30-minute video that Cinemassacre did about which Dracula film is the closest to the book, from what I understand, this one is. And so I think that has a lot to do with it, but it feels like it brings the best of both worlds while injecting its own kind of almost weird 90s aesthetic to it. And there's a lot of weirdness to it, but there's a lot of really cool, creepy special effects, like Dracula climbing like Spider-Man across the wall, and it almost takes it really leans into the spiritual and demonic aspect of Dracula, where he's almost like a demon or possessed by a demon. They have a lot of like exorcist type moments where he's like vomiting blood or making things move, like a poltergeist kind of thing, and so I love all of that, and obviously the cast is incredible, save Keanu, who I don't know why he's in this movie, and his terrible accent. It's just so strange. It's like totally out of his wheelhouse, and you can tell that he's just being completely eclipsed by all the other actors. I don't know why they decided to choose him, but even he gets a little bit more tolerable as the movie goes on. But the rest of the cast is just absolutely incredible. Gary Oldman as Dracula is really eccentric, and he reminds me, and I don't know if this was intentional or if it's just a coincidence or what, but he totally reminds me of the Emperor Palpatine, especially in his wrinkled, old, withered form.
Yeah, definitely the look.
The look for sure, but even
reminiscent.
the personality to a certain extent, it reminded me a little bit of it. And then I really like his kind of young form that he romances Mina with. He has this kind of top hat, very kind of ridiculous theatrical outfit on, and I just think it's really, really cool. And then just the characters and everything, the character relationships and how everything ends up playing out is definitely the most cohesive and narratively satisfying of the three, even if it isn't the most like traditional kind of horror story.
Yeah, for me, from my recollection, and you're right, I do need to watch it again, because I was coming from a very different place than I would be watching it now. I think I was on a date when I saw it in the theater back then, and I was very young. But so I will say yes, it's definitely the closest to the book, and just a brief shout out for the book for anyone out there who has not read Dracula, and if you were like me that said, I'd love to read the original Dracula to have all the background, but it's one of those old books that's going to be super slow. It is an epistolary novel, or at least parts of it are, which is written in letter forms, people writing letters, and I would say it starts out, it can be a little exposition and draggy from a modern standpoint at the opening of the book, but it morphs into something that reads very much like a much more contemporary, like horror adventure mystery book by, especially toward the end. I was really surprised how current, how similar to current fiction. So if you're afraid of reading it, give it a try. And if you make it, definitely, it's almost like Lord of the Rings. If you make it past that super boring opening section, it's really good. The movie itself, the reaction, Keanu Reeves made the movie hard to watch. And everybody knew, and I think it was just one of those things. I don't know whether it was maybe the studio forced Keanu Reeves onto Coppola because he was kind of the hot young box office star at the time. But God, he is completely out of his depth in this movie. Everyone else is tremendous. Anthony Hopkins, Winona Ryder, and et al. The movie struck me as being like very creepy. It would go from being sort of very kind of this gothic Victorian to really sort of almost over the top. I don't know, I won't say gore, but like kind of super creepy stuff. Then it would get super trippy. And it just, to me at the time watching it, just felt like, I'm like, what is this movie trying to be? But yeah, I would have to go back and watch it again. But overall, I remember the visuals just being tremendous. I remember the other performances being tremendous. And that kooky outfit that was even out of place sort of in its time that Dracula was walking around wearing, that comes up in the novel as well. Like he's wearing these clothes that are kind of like sort of conspicuous even for the time. So yeah, it does capture a lot of the book, and that demonic aspect, which that's also something that so it really does probably best of all pull the themes of the book into the film, and definitely deserves another watch for me. So that is a wrap on Dracula, the first in our Halloween classic horror character monster movie mash. Frankenstein will be coming for sure, along with some others, and definitely more Marvel content coming as some of the other shows and movies finally come about. So thanks for joining us again, and please come back for our next Worlds Beyond with Cam and Ron.
Woo! Thanks, guys. See you next time.